Okay, well, we're studying in the last 3 chapters of the book of Daniel, and we've said that they're all really one unit. Chapter 10 was an introduction to this unit and to Daniel's final vision. We saw there that at the beginning of this vision in chapter 11, Daniel was praying and fasting, and his prayer gave praise to God, and then he confessed his sins and the sins of his people. Then he made his request. What a great pattern for that is for us to follow in our prayers as well. Praise, confession, before we get to all of our requests. God answered Daniel's prayer by sending an angel to tell him about events to come that would affect the Jews. The last 2 weeks, we've been studying the first part of chapter 11. And it's been a lot of history being thrown at you, I know, because the way we're approaching this is to look at these prophecies that God gave and then see how they were actually fulfilled in history. It was future to Daniel's time, but past to our time. So the angel told Daniel about the future leaders of the Persian Empire. He then prophesied that the coming of a mighty king, who was Alexander the Great. But then Alexander would die at the age of 32 and leave no heir. The Greek Empire was divided up among Alexander's 4 generals. Well, the prophecy then focused on 2 of these generals, 2 of these emerging empires. The king of the north was the area that we today know as Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Syria and Lebanon, that area kind of north of Israel. The king of the south was primarily Egypt and those areas to the south, but at times that king of Egypt also came up into Israel and some of the Mediterranean islands and overtook those for a brief while as part of his territory. So these 2 empires are the north and south of Israel, the beautiful land, and they would have a profound impact on Israel because of their ongoing conflicts with one another. The king of the north, the first king of the north, was Seleucus. He was one of Alexander's generals, and then the dynasty that followed from him. And so we call them the Seleucids, and sometimes we also just refer to them in shorthand as Syria because that's part of the area they occupied. The king of the south was Ptolemy and the dynasty that followed him, and that was in the south, again, primarily Egypt. So for the next 150 years, these 2 kingdoms would be at war with one another. And in order to fight one another, they've got to go through Israel. So Israel's getting marched through back and forth as these kingdoms jostle with one another. So the Jews are suffering all that comes along with having occupying armies and battles on their territory. Well, then verses 15 to 20 describe many details of these battles. There were alliances, there was political intrigue that took place during the times of conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. Initially, Ptolemy supported Seleucus because Ptolemy was stronger. And so he helped Seleucus in his fight to control and gain territory. But things fell apart a little while later when Ptolemy II wanted to form an alliance by giving his daughter, Berenice, to Antiochus II as a wife. Antiochus was already married with children, so Ptolemy died quickly thereafter, and things kind of fell apart. That arrangement wasn't honored. So Antiochus, both of his wives and the children ended up being killed. Ptolemy III was the brother of Berenice, and he wanted to avenge the death of his sister, so he conquered much of the Seleucid Empire. Well, we continued between these empires as we saw the war go on. Seleucus II and Antiochus III attacked the Ptolemies. A successful and brutal counterattack came from Ptolemy IV, and that led to Ptolemaic superiority for a while. But this was short-lived as Antiochus III, who was also known as Antiochus the Great, would gain strength, and he would attack again with a strong army and with allies from Israel, which led to Seleucids' control over Israel. So again, they're getting bounced around here. Another alliance by marriage was attempted. This time, Antiochus III gives his daughter, Cleopatra, not the famous Cleopatra, but the first Cleopatra named into the Egyptian dynasty. He gave her to Ptolemy V, and he was hoping that she would influence Ptolemy V to side with him. Ptolemy V was still quite young, probably a teenager, and Cleopatra was maybe a few years older, But it turned out that when she went down there, she sided with her husband rather than her father. So it didn't work out the way Dad wanted it to. Well, Antiochus III would then focus on his expanding empire on the north and the west rather than focusing on Egypt to the south. He had some initial success, but he was defeated by the Romans and forced to go back to his own land. He was really under the control of Rome, sort of as a vassal state. He was forced to pay tribute to them. He was forced to pay some war reparations, and he was to provide members of his royal family as hostages. Well, Antiochus was killed as he tried to plunder a temple to raise money to pay the tribute. Seleucus IV would follow after Antiochus III, but only reigned for a brief time, as he was poisoned by his tax collector, and so as the scripture said, he didn't die in battle. So you've got all of this drama going on with the political intrigue and the giving of wives in marriage and the fighting of one another and brother against brother, and so it was a real mess there. And we're going to see that continues tonight as we go into the next part of the chapter. So tonight, So tonight the story continues. Here there's a focus on the king of the north, and one particular king who arose, and he's described as contemptible. And we'll remember the reasons that God gave this prophecy. There were three main reasons. They reveal a God who is sovereign. He's alone is worthy of our praise. These prophecies reveal a covenant-keeping God who is faithful and does not abandon his people. His mercy endures forever. And the third reason for these prophecies is they gave Daniel and the Jews encouragement for the present and also a warning or preparation for the future. The Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, but they still weren't free. They would still be subject to the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. God didn't want them to be caught unaware of what was coming up and what they'd have to face. Well, let's take a look at our passage for tonight, verses 21 through 35. And as I read this, let's do our overview exercise, so make note of any important words that kind of help to summarize this passage. So, Daniel 11, beginning in verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. But it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Okay, so what words kind of help us get our head around this passage?
Appointed time.
I'm sorry,
Appointed time.
A despicable person will arise.
Against the holy covenant, violate the covenant.
okay, very good.
And the people who know God.
Yeah. Good, okay. Okay. Well, we encountered Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes previously in chapter 8. There was the goat that sped across the earth, and he had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. The horn broke off and was replaced by 4 other horns. And from one of those horns arose a rather small horn. So this was the whole vision about Greece and Alexander charging across the earth. And the horn was cut off, so Alexander died young. The 4 horns arose, his generals, and then from one of those, there was what is referred to as a rather small horn, and this was the picture of Antiochus Epiphanes. In verse 21, he is called a contemptible or despicable person. The Greek historian Polybius, who was a contemporary of Antiochus, wrote that he often lounged like a mere idler about in the streets of Antioch. He was attended by 2 or 3 servants. He was known to drink and carouse with the young men. His undignified conduct contributed to Polybius and others to give him the nickname of Epiphanes. So it's kind of a clever play on the words. He named himself Epiphanes, the magnificent one, but they called him Epimenes, which meant the insane one. So they had a little clever play on words there. Kind of poking fun at him and his presumptuousness and giving himself this grand name. Well, here this word for contemptible or despicable, as some versions translate it, is the Hebrew word baza. It means to look down upon something or to view something with disdain. It can also mean to despise in the sense of treating someone or something as totally insignificant or worthless. It's used in a number of other places in the Old Testament. We see it first in Genesis 25:34.
Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
So that's that same word. If you remember that story about how Esau just had no regard for his own birthright. That's that word baza. And then we see it again in 1 Chronicles 15:29.
Verse 29, or the whole thing.
Chapter 15, verse 29?
Yeah, right, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It happened when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and celebrating, and she despised him in her heart.
So there again, if you remember that story, how David is dancing and his wife just looks at him and she's embarrassed by him and just kind of disgusted and she has no regard for him. Same word that we see here used about Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, this is true in a couple different senses with Antiochus. The Jews looked upon him with contempt, but it's also true that he looked upon God's altar, God's table, and God's temple with contempt. So it kind of has two meanings there as far as he's concerned. He undervalued and he had no regard for the Jews or for their God. Well, verse 21 goes on to describe this person as one to whom royal majesty has not been given. And here's why this is the correct description of Antiochus Epiphanes. As we said previously, when his father, Antiochus the Great, lost the battle of Magnesia, he was forced to sign a treaty at Apamea. And this treaty of Apamea called for Antiochus the Great, or Syria, to give up territory, to pay war reparations, and then they had to pay an annual tribute to Rome. The other thing that was required in this treaty was that the Roman council would go and select 20 noble youths and take them to Rome as hostages. So that was a way of kind of keeping the Syrians in line because they had some of their family held hostage. Well, Antiochus the Great, his third son was Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. So he was the one that was chosen to go to Rome. So this person who had become this contemptible one was actually taken to Rome in his youth and was held hostage there for a while. So he does have some exposure to Rome and some of that life, and that probably plays out a little bit later on in his life. The hostages would be exchanged every few years, except for Antiochus. He was kept there. Well, some years later, Antiochus the Great died, and his oldest son was Seleucus IV, and so he came to the throne. The hostage, his brother Antiochus IV, was exchanged, and Seleucus' son Demetrius, who was the heir after Seleucus, he was sent to Rome as a hostage. Well, shortly after that time, Seleucus was assassinated by one of his government ministers named Heliodorus. Well, Heliodorus proclaimed himself the regent for the heir Demetrius. And Antiochus IV then sees this opportunity. He's left Rome by this time. He's living in Athens. And he sees here's some weakness in the throne, and so he's going to jump in and take advantage of it. So he goes back to Syria. He proclaimed himself the regent on behalf of another one of Seleucus' sons, who was an infant at the time. And so he claims the throne. Well, at the same time, he's aligning himself with the king of Pergamum, and so he seizes this throne of Syria for himself. The young Antiochus dies a few years later, probably murdered by Antiochus IV, and so that leaves him as the emperor of this Seleucid Empire, Emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's how he seized power. So he was not in the royal line in that sense, but part of the royal family, but he came in and seized power when he saw the opportunity. Verse 21 goes on to say that he will come in without warning, or other versions say that he will come in during a time of tranquility or peace. And both these renderings are true. Antiochus was stealthy in his approach to taking the crown, and the people were also at ease at that time of relative peace in between some of the conflicts they had. So he would obtain the kingdom by flatteries. He persuaded the Greek nobles of the Seleucids to support him in his quest to take the throne. And because of his time in Rome, he also enlisted some help from some Romans and got their backing for him too. So here's a bust of Antiochus Epiphanes, what we think he looked like, somebody thought he looked like. And then there's also his image on a coin. This is minted around 170 BC, give or take. He's there on one side wearing his diadem, and on the back side there's an unnamed goddess. So there's Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, verses 22 through 24 are a reference to the military victories Antiochus Epiphanes would have over his enemies. Some think that the Prince of the Covenant that's mentioned here is a reference to the high priest, Onias III, whom Antiochus had murdered. But more likely, it's a reference to Ptolemy VI. Antiochus made a treaty with Ptolemy, but he never intended to keep it. And we have language in here that talks about some of that intrigue. So part of his deceit was to come to Egypt with a small army so that it wouldn't raise any concerns. So in what was a time of relative peace, Antiochus took his small army and he launched a series of bloody wars. This was his first campaign into Egypt. He would be successful, but only for a time. The Romans were also keeping an eye on the events that were going on there between Syria and Egypt. And they would eventually encourage Antiochus to return home and leave Egypt alone. Verses 25 to 27 describe this ongoing conflict between Antiochus Epiphanes and the Egyptians. The king of the south was one of the Ptolemies at that time. So Antiochus' army grew great, and Ptolemy VI also assembled a large army in opposition. Ptolemy will not stand because of the schemes and alliances of Antiochus. Well, verse 27 says that these two kings will speak lies to each other. They signed treaties, but they had no intention of keeping them. In that sense, they shared the same table while their hearts were intent on evil, as the scripture says. But the end will come at the appointed time. That time is appointed by God. While these kingdoms plot and scheme evil against one another, God has their days numbered. And we see that in, well, first of all, before we go there, let's go to the map so you get an idea here of what we're talking about. So there's a solid line and a dotted line. They're right next to each other. And one represents the first campaign of Antiochus into Egypt, and the other is the second campaign, and they just parallel each other. You follow the same route. And let me magnify some of this here. So you see what he's doing is he's really trying to go and capture Egypt as far south as Memphis, and then to the north and east to Alexandria. So that whole area there, that Nile Delta, is the rich portion of the land, the most fertile portion of the land. So that's the focus of his intentions. That's where he's trying to go. He never quite conquered Alexandria. He got to the near it, to the outskirts of it, but never captured the city. But both of his campaigns are really following that same route. Along the way, he's had a lot of victories through these cities, and so he's captured a lot of treasure. And he's used that treasure then to bribe and influence some others to cooperate with him. He pretends to be an ally, and so he used the enemy to his advantage. His victories were so great that the king of Egypt became virtually his prisoner at one point. But it says he would only be successful for a time. The Romans were keeping an eye on him. And as I said, in verses 25 to 27, we see this ongoing conflict between him and the Egyptians. Verse 27 says that these two kings will speak lies to each other, and we saw how they did continually do this, even while they would eat together and seemingly get along and seemingly make treaties. They had every intent of breaking them. But the evil will come to an end at the appointed time, and that time is appointed by God. So while these kingdoms are plotting and scheming against one another, God has their days numbered. There are a couple of verses that talk about God numbering our days and the days of the kings. The first one is in Psalm 39, verses 4 through 7.
O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handprints, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are into one. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you.
So these kings are an example of what was written there in the Psalms. They heap up wealth. They think their lives are never going to end, but God has numbered their days. And then also we see a similar thought in Proverbs 21:1.
The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, who turns it wherever he wills.
So God's the one that's in control of these kings. Through his schemes and alliances, Antiochus did gain control of most of Egypt. Well, verses 28 to 30 describe the end of Antiochus' first major campaign against Egypt. And this is taking place around 170 BC. He got so far, but then he withdraws to Syria. And on his way back, he passes through Jerusalem. He later returns for a second campaign in 168 BC, and then he'll return again back to Syria. So both campaigns, he kind of made the loop on back. Both times he went back through Jerusalem. At the end of the first campaign in Egypt, the Romans encouraged him to return to Syria. Antiochus had acquired a lot of wealth from plundering Egypt during his conquests. One of the reasons for his return was that the Romans encouraged him to leave Egypt. They wanted to put limits on his exploits. They also had interests in the area, and they wanted to keep him in check. A second reason for his return was there was a report that came to him about the Jews. There was a rumor that was circulating among the Jews that Antiochus was dead. And so they were rejoicing at the prospect of Antiochus being dead. Well, that greatly angered Antiochus, so his heart was set against the Holy Covenant, as is described here. He sought revenge on the Jews for rejoicing at hearing the rumor of his death. Verse 29 says, "It shall not be this time as it was before." So this is a reference to Antiochus' second campaign in Egypt. It ended abruptly when he ran afoul of some of the Roman interests. Again, Rome enters the picture here with the Seleucids. It talks about Kittim, it mentions Kittim in verse 30, and that can mean a location, a specific location on the island of Cyprus, but it can also just generally refer to parts of the Mediterranean, and also became synonymous then with Rome. The Dead Sea Scrolls use the word Kittim a number of times as a reference to Rome. So there was one event that has some notoriety in history, and that's when a Roman envoy goes to meet him. The Roman envoy was Gaius Popilius Laenas, and he came from Rome, and he met Antiochus as he was approaching Alexandria. So Antiochus is heading toward there. He's a few miles away from Alexandria, and the Roman envoy comes and meets him. And Antiochus gives him a friendly greeting and holds out his hand to the envoy, but the envoy ignores that. Instead, he placed some tablets in Antiochus' hand, which contained a decree from the Roman Senate, and it was a decree for Antiochus to withdraw from Egypt. So Antiochus says, well, let me get together and meet with my friends, and I'll think about what we're going to do. So then Popilius, the envoy, reached out his cane and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. And he said, before you step out of that circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate. Well, Antiochus hesitated for a few moments, and then he said, I will do what the Senate thinks right. So he was intimidated, somewhat embarrassed there by the Roman envoy. And this may be where we get the phrase, drawing a line in the sand. There are other suggested origins of that phrase, but this is one possibility from antiquity. Well, Antiochus then withdrew his troops rather than face war with the Roman Republic. This is one copperplate print from the late 1700s about this event. And let me magnify part of this here so you can see this. Interesting depiction of Antiochus there with his headdress and all his I don't know, feathers or whatever coming out of it. He looks so pompous and so proud. And there's Popilius drawing that line around him with his cane. I think you can see the line in the sand there around Antiochus.
Was he known to be small?
No, I think that's just the art. I don't think we know anything about his height. I think that's just the artist's impression. Yeah. And then one other rendering of this event. Now, this is by an Italian in the 1650s, so people kind of have costumes from that period. We've often seen that in art. But here again, kind of a pompous portrayal of Antiochus, which seemed to fit from what we know about him. So there he is in his royal garb. He's got his hand on his hip, looking pretty proud. And there's the Romans drawing the circle around him and daring him to step out of it. Well, as I said, on both of these returns, of these two campaigns coming from Egypt, heading toward Egypt, Antiochus returns to Syria, and he has to pass through Jerusalem to get to Syria. Both times he's outraged at the Jews in Jerusalem. Verse 30 says he was disheartened. The first time, after his first campaign, he was angry about the rumor circulating among the Jews about his death. The second time he comes back after his second campaign, he's angry because he's been embarrassed by the Roman envoy in front of his troops. Well, then we see this phrase here in verse 28 that says, he shall work his will. And there's a lot packed into that phrase. Other translations simply say he will take action. And we read about some of this, something similar in verse 30, where it says that he will take action against the Holy Covenant. So again, on his returns back through Jerusalem, he's taking action. Antiochus brought great devastation to Jerusalem both times he marched back to the area. He plundered the city. He slayed more than 80,000 Jews. He took 40,000 prisoners, and he sold another 40,000 Jews into slavery. He also lashed out against the temple because, as verse 28 says, his heart is set against the Holy Covenant. The Hebrew word translated be enraged in verse 30 literally means foaming at the mouth. So that's a picture of his state of the anger that he had. This is the level of his outrage against the Jews. He entered the sanctuary and he carried off the vessels of gold and silver, as well as 1,800 talents of gold. But he did show favor towards some of the Jews who had supported him, and those are the ones who forsake the Holy Covenant. Well, then in verse 31, we get a further description of the despicable acts of Antiochus. He sends troops to suspend the regular sacrifice in the temple. Daniel learned of this event in his earlier dream. We read about this in Daniel 8:11. Somebody has Daniel 8:11.
It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown.
So the angel told that to Daniel in his first dream. Here it's reinforced here that this despicable one to come is going to interrupt the sacrifice. The physical sanctuary was sacred. It was devoted to the worship of Yahweh. It was sacred because it was the place where God dwelled among his people. And we see this going back to the tabernacle, Exodus 25, verse 8.
And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst.
So that was true of the tabernacle and then later became true in the temple. Well, the prophecy then states that he will set up the abomination that makes desolate. The Hebrew word for abomination is a very strong word, meaning something that is filthy, detestable, disgusting. It's often associated with idols which are detestable in God's sight. Jeremiah uses this in describing the idols in Jeremiah 16, verses 17 and 18.
For my eyes are on all their ways. They are not hidden from me, nor is their iniquity concealed from my eyes. But first I will doubly repay their iniquity and their sin, because they have polluted my land with the carcasses of their detestable idols, and have filled my inheritance with their abomination.
So those idols were detestable, filthy, abominable in the sight of God. The word for desolation that's used here means ruin or waste caused by a great disaster. Often it's associated with divine judgment. We see this in Leviticus 26, 31, and 32.
And I will lay your cities waste and will make your sanctuaries desolate. And I will not smell your pleasing aromas. And I may myself will devastate the land, so that you, your enemies who settle in it, shall be appalled at it.
Well, we know from history and from some of the books in the Apocrypha, the books of the Maccabees, that Antiochus Epiphanes and his men entered the temple in Jerusalem, and they set up the abomination that makes desolate in 168 BC. He sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. He erected a statue of Zeus in the temple for the people to worship. And he turned the priests' chambers into brothels. So through these acts, he defiled the temple. This was an abomination that caused desolation because the temple was desolate of pious Jews. They would not enter the temple because the altar was desecrated and its true purpose was destroyed. They had no desire to worship in such a polluted environment. Well, this is a prophecy that had a short-term fulfillment with Antiochus Epiphanes, but there will be another fulfillment in the future. We know this because Jesus said it was coming. And he told us this in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 22.
The time will come when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration, standing in the holy place. Reader, I guess that's me. Pay attention. And those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person outside or up on the roof must not go inside to pack. A person in the field must not return to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for mothers nursing their babies in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for that will be a time of greater horror than anything the world has ever seen or will ever see again. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, the entire human race will be destroyed. But it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones.
This prophecy that Daniel sees then looks forward to Antiochus Epiphanes in its fulfillment, but also it looks farther ahead into the future to the coming Antichrist and what he will do. He will also desecrate the temple by setting up another abomination that makes desolate. We read of this in Revelation 13, verses 11 to 15.
Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast to deceive those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain.
So here in these verses, we're getting our first hint that there is a short-term fulfillment of this prophecy and a long-term fulfillment, and we'll see next time even more that we're going to be looking forward to in our aspect as well. Verse 32 says, the contemptible person will be a smooth talker who seduces with flattery. Some Jews were persuaded into the ways of Antiochus. They convinced many other Jews to make an alliance with the Gentiles. They said that many evils had come upon them since they were separated from the Gentiles, so they wanted to come back and make an alliance with them. They allied themselves with the Gentiles by sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath, thus abandoning the Holy Covenant. But note the contrast here. There are those who knew their God, and they would stand firm and take action. They knew God and His Word, and they were emboldened to act. Verse 33 says, they will give understanding to the many. These are references to the opposition that arose to Antiochus Epiphanes. A revolt started when Mattathias, the leading priest in the city of Modin in the hill country of Ephraim, killed the officer of Antiochus who came to enforce the new decree concerning idol worship. His 5 sons led a guerrilla band that fled to the hills. Many of these brave men were killed because they refused to fight on the Sabbath. Well, they later revised that policy and they continued the fight. When Mattathias died, one of his sons, Judas Maccabeus, led the charge. As verse 34 states, many joined this revolt, but only pretended to be loyal. Some joined as an escape from their troubles. Judas Maccabeus was eventually successful in reclaiming and purifying the temple, but there was a great cost. Many men were lost in the effort, but it was that they would be refined, purified, and made white, as this verse says. Some think that this phrase here, until the time of the end, refers to the end of the War of the Maccabees. But given the section that follows, I think maybe it's better understood that it's talking about the persecution the Jews are going to face throughout history until the final period of time that's yet future. And indeed, we've seen this play out throughout history with the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, the pogroms, the Holocaust that have taken place. Well, next time we're going to continue with the description of this contemptible person. But again, this is something that is in a time that is yet to come. It's yet future to us as we pick up in verse 36 next time. Well, let's have a couple application questions, a little discussion around that. What do we see about God in this passage tonight?
He's got the heart of the king in his hand. And then what he says here is true. It came true.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls all but confirm, and they're still testing and they're still doing, paleographic dating and all that. But even just looking at it, Googling just to see what's kind of the latest datings of this, it's always earlier and earlier. So just a little excerpt from the research article. This is by someone that's reputable. He's reporting that some of the scrolls of Daniel were dated to 230 to 160 BC, making it highly improbable that Daniel was written after the death of Antiochus IV. In other words, this almost without a doubt, the book of Daniel was written before Antiochus was born, and that's just a fact. That's not, oh, those conservative Christians or Jews wish it was true, but it is almost certainly a fact that the writing dates before, and that's the writing of the Dead Sea Scroll.
Yeah.
So that means that the originals had to have been before that. Like, by the time they're writing Daniel, Dead Sea Scrolls, Daniel's already in the Jewish culture established as canon. So when we say that this was written for sure before Antiochus, we just mean that particular Dead Sea Scroll, which means that the actual writing of the book of Daniel had been before that, and before enough that it was seen as scripture by the Jewish people, such that they would say this is something we need to write down and pass on. So for sure, for a fact, just modern, even secular scholarship, this was written 100%, like 100% before it said it happened. It just for a fact. And it says here at a time appointed, in verse 29, and all throughout. So who appointed these things before they happened? It's God. It's so obvious. I feel like everyone has to recognize that. Everyone on planet Earth needs to be made aware of the fact that you have to have an explanation for this. And I don't know how you do it. If you're just a secular, non-supernaturalist, how do you? All of this was written before. They happened. So how do you reckon with any of that? You got to do a lot of mental gymnastics and moral gymnastics even to get around it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
People don't want to believe it.
We'll take an amen next time.
That's right.
Well, then how about this? We read here about some of these Jews compromised themselves, and they joined with Antiochus, and they tried to form an alliance, if you will, with the Greeks, or with the Gentiles, and placate them. But there were some that knew God, and they stood firm and they took action. So how has knowing God helped you to stand firm and take action?
Knowing that God's behind it, His power and strength for the right things, for righteousness.
That has to help you at UCI when you stand behind a table and confront people, right? I mean,
He gives us all we need.
any other thoughts on that?
Well, I've seen a lot of false teaching lately, and I think if you're discerning, if you're in the Word, then you're discerning when that false teaching is given. So I think the action that you're taking is rejecting the false doctrine. It's incredible right now.
It is.
Yeah.
And many people who haven't made it people believers who don't know the word or are in it, they don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's the truth. I think a lot of pastors also are just adding on to the word and taking away from the word, and they're just like, where do you get that? And it's just crushing. But at least you have the discernment, if you've been in the word, to know it's false doctrine. So that's how knowing God helps you stand firm. I don't know if you take any action except for within yourself. Check it out.
Okay. Well, thanks for being patient with the history lesson the last few weeks. There's been a lot coming at you. I know we're gonna
Say there's gonna be.
be a little,
No quiz, please.
yeah. I didn't give you a lot of homework though, right?
This is like,
So
I would have to have a chart of mine somewhere.
next week is a little more forward-looking as we continue to talk about this contemptible person, but the focus really turns to the coming contemptible person. So we'll be looking ahead a little more. Well, let me pray and we can be on our way.